trams in the German city of Leipzig have stopped running. Not because of a strike, not because of an accident, but because the asphalt between the tracks has begun to melt. The joint sealant, designed to hold concrete and steel together, has turned to a black viscous sludge, clumping in the switches and jamming the mechanisms. In just a few days, a modern European public transit system has been defeated by the ground it was built on. At the same time, firefighters 100 kilometers away in Saxony were forced to retreat, not from flames, not from smoke, but from the sound of explosions. A wildfire sparked by relentless heat in the Gorescheide forest was cooking unexploded World War II ammunition buried for 80 years, turning a containment operation into a fight against a ghost army. This is the state of Europe in the summer of 2026, a continent under siege from an invisible enemy. As of early July, over 130 million people are enduring temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius. More than 2,900 people are already dead. And the fundamental systems that underpin modern life, power, transport, water, are beginning to fail in ways their designers never imagined. The crisis started not with a bang, but with a change in the air. In late May, an enormous stagnant bubble of high pressure settled over the continent. Meteorologists call it a heat dome. It's fed by a relentless plume of hot air drawn north from the Sahara, an atmospheric conveyor belt known as the African anticyclone. The science is simple. Sinking air under the dome compresses, and as it compresses, it heats up. Day after day, under cloudless skies, the ground just gets hotter. John Kennedy, the head of climate information at the World Meteorological Organization, is not surprised. He is, however, alarmed. He notes that Europe is the fastest warming continent on Earth and has already heated by an average of 2 degrees Celsius since the landmark heatwave of 1976. This isn't a freak summer. This is a new climate imposing itself on an old world. The numbers that began flashing on weather station screens in late June were not just records, they were warnings. It started in the west. On June 22nd, the Mercury in Andújar and Montoro, twin towns in Spain's Andalusia region, climbed to 45.1 degrees Celsius. That's 113 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the peak air temperature measured on the continent. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The European Space Agency's Sentinel-3 satellite, which measures the temperature of the physical ground itself, recorded surface temperatures in Spain of 55 degrees Celsius. That's 131 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause contact burns, hot enough to melt the soles of your shoes. This is the temperature the world is made of. From Spain, the furnace-like air bled north. In France, the town of Pissos, south of Bordeaux, hit 44.3 degrees Celsius, a regional record. In Paris, a city famously unequipped for heat, the temperature broke 40 degrees, forcing the National Railway Company, SNCF, to take drastic action. Steel expands when heated. Over hundreds of kilometers, that expansion can warp rails and snap the delicate overhead power lines. Faced with the risk of mass derailments, the SNCF canceled 71 intercity trains. A country ground to a halt not because something was broken, but because everything was working exactly as the laws of physics dictated it should. By June 28th, the thermal peak had shifted, migrating east like a biblical plague. Germany's meteorological service, the Deutscher Wetterdienst, watched in disbelief as a small town in Brandenburg, called Cochin, reported 41.7 degrees Celsius, shattering the country's all-time national heat record. That same afternoon, across the border in the Czech Republic, the town of Doksany went even higher, 41.9 degrees. The next day, Slovakia fell, with Trnava nad Bodvou hitting 41 degrees, another national record erased. In the heart of Switzerland, the city of Basel, a hub of finance and pharmaceuticals, baked at an unprecedented 39 degrees. One by one, the historical limits of European climate were being breached and discarded. But it's in Hungary that all the cascading failures of this crisis converge into a single terrifying paradox. To understand what is happening on the European grid, you have to understand the Paks nuclear power plant and the river it depends on. The plant, run by the state-owned MVM Group, sits on the banks of the Danube River in Tolna County. It's the only nuclear plant in the country, and it provides about half of Hungary's electricity. It is the baseload, the foundation upon which the nation's entire energy system rests. And on June 29, 2026, it began to fail. A nuclear reactor is, at its heart, a machine for boiling water. That process generates an immense amount of waste heat, which must be constantly carried away. The Paks plant, like most inland reactors, uses river water for this cooling. It pulls in cooler water, circulates it, and discharges slightly warmer water back into the river. This process is governed by strict environmental laws. To prevent ecological damage to the river, the discharged water cannot be too hot, and the river itself cannot exceed a certain temperature threshold. For the Danube at Paks, that threshold was 29.5 degrees Celsius. But as the heat dome intensified, the Danube itself was being cooked. The river, which starts in the Black Forest of Germany and winds its way through 10 countries, was absorbing solar radiation across thousands of square kilometers. By the last week of June, the water temperature at the plant's intake pipes was creeping closer and closer to the legal limit. As millions of Hungarians turned on their air conditioners to survive the 40-degree heat, the power plant designed to keep the lights on was being slowly suffocated by the very crisis it was meant to alleviate. On June 29th, the unthinkable happened. The Danube's water temperature hit 30.22 degrees Celsius. The plant was now in an impossible position. Continuing to operate meant violating environmental law, discharging dangerously hot water into an already stressed river ecosystem. But shutting down reactors was not an option. It would trigger rolling blackouts across a country already in the grip of a deadly natural disaster. The decision fell to Hungary's new government, led by Prime Minister Péter Magyar. Magyar, a pro-European who had just swept to power in a shocking landslide election in April, ending the long reign of Viktor Orban, was facing his first true national crisis just months into his term. He had run on a platform of transparency and adherence to European norms. Now, he was being asked to break the rules to keep his country alive. The call was made by his economy and energy minister, István Kapitányi. An emergency waiver was granted. Paks was given a temporary exemption from the environmental regulations, allowing it to continue operating even as it dumped superheated water into the suffering Danube. On one hand, it was a pragmatic choice, the lesser of two evils. On the other, it was a terrifying milestone. A modern European state was now cannibalizing its own natural environment to power the machines that were protecting its citizens from an unnatural climate. The market immediately understood the severity of the situation, in the face of crippling demand and a faltering supply. Day-ahead power prices in Hungary spiked by almost 80% in a single week, hitting over 222 euros per megawatt hour. The cost of survival was becoming brutally clear. For Magyar, it was a political baptism by fire. The two hardest days of the heat wave are coming, he told the nation. Let's show that we are capable of complete national unity. Let's look out for each other. His words were a plea for solidarity in the face of a problem that no single government could solve. The heat dome was not just a weather event. It was a stress test for an entire continent's infrastructure, politics, and social cohesion. And the stress is revealing weaknesses in the most unexpected places. In the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate, 650 people were evacuated from the town of Triesen. A wildfire, started by the extreme heat and drought, had reached a former munitions disposal site. The heat from the fire began triggering uncontrolled explosions of old ordnance. Again, firefighters were helpless. They could only pull back and watch as the legacy of a past war was reawakened by the pressures of the new climate war. This is the part the headlines do not capture. The danger isn't just the oppressive heat of the afternoon sun. It is the insidious, creeping warmth of the night. Armel Castellan, an advisor at the WHO-DOMO Climate and Health Joint Office, has a name for them. Tropical nights. These are nights when the temperature never drops below 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. For the human body, this is the Gendrenton killer. Nighttime is when the body is supposed to recover, Castellan explains. When nights stay warm, that recovery does not happen, the body remains under strain around the clock. Much of Europe's iconic architecture, the stone and brick buildings that have stood for centuries, were designed for a different climate. They were built to survive brutal winters, to absorb the heat of the day and slowly radiate it back into the living space at night, keeping inhabitants warm. In a world of 40-degree summer days, these beautiful historic homes become inescapable traps. They absorb solar radiation all day, and with no significant nighttime cooling, they turn into slow cookers. The thick stone walls that once offered shelter now offer a suffocating, unrelenting warmth. With air conditioning still a relative rarity in European homes, there is no escape. The official death toll, now over 2,900 and climbing, tells the story. These are not primarily deaths of people collapsing from heat stroke in the streets. They are the quiet, invisible deaths of the elderly and the vulnerable, occurring behind closed doors, in third-floor apartments in Paris, Berlin, and Madrid as their bodies simply give up after days without relief. The WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, has raised the alarm personally, shocked by the scale of the mortality. A late June spike alone accounted for over 1,300 excess deaths. France reported 1,040 deaths, Spain 1,209, Germany 810. These are not abstract statistics. They are grandparents, neighbors, and friends. They are the first wave of casualties in a new kind of conflict. And the battle is being fought everywhere. In Rome, where more than 20 cities remain under the highest red alert, Pope Leo XIV was forced to physically intervene during an outdoor address in St. Peter's Square, providing first aid to a pilgrim who had fainted from the sweltering heat. The scene was a surreal tableau, a spiritual leader battling a very physical, very immediate threat. The crisis is forcing a radical, uncomfortable honesty from Europe's leaders. Confronted with the undeniable reality of melting roads and failing power grids, the political patience for denial has evaporated. Teresa Ribera, the European Commission's executive vice president for the green transition, delivered a blistering condemnation of climate deniers and the fossil fuel lobbyists who have delayed action for decades. "This is a dramatic warning being sent once again by nature," she declared. "We need to reject this kind of bullshit based on lies and against people's interests." The language, for a high-ranking Brussels official, was shocking, but it matched the moment. The time for polite debate was over. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were burning through forests full of bombs and boiling the continent's greatest rivers. Professor Mojib Latif, a leading climate scientist at the Guillaume R. Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research, has been warning of this for years. He argues that the conversation must shift from mitigation alone to urgent adaptation. Europe's infrastructure, he emphasizes, is fundamentally mismatched to its new climate reality. Cities designed in the 19th century cannot cope with the conditions of the 21st. The Leipzig tram system wasn't shut down by a faulty part. It was shut down because the chemical properties of asphalt have a thermal limit, and that limit was breached. The French rail system wasn't poorly maintained. It was engineered for a climate that no longer exists. These are not failures of maintenance. They are failures of imagination. And the costs of that failure will compound. The fires in Gowerscheid and Trizen are not just spectacular anomalies. They are a sign of a future where dormant risks, both natural and man-made, are reactivated by extreme weather. What other forgotten dangers lie buried in the soil of Europe, waiting for the right thermal trigger? What other components of our complex interconnected systems have a secret failure point that only a 40-degree day can reveal? As the heatwave peaks in Eastern Europe, the immediate focus is on survival. But the long-term questions are beginning to surface. If a major industrial nation like Hungary is forced to choose between its power grid and its largest river, what does that mean for the future of energy policy? The Paks nuclear plant was supposed to be a bastion of energy independence, immune to the volatility of geopolitical gas supplies. Yet it turned out to be profoundly vulnerable to the weather. The crisis demonstrates a difficult truth. In a warming world, even zero-carbon energy sources are not immune. Solar panels lose efficiency in extreme heat. Wind turbines can be damaged by supercell thunderstorms that accompany thermal instability. And nuclear reactors need cool rivers that are no longer guaranteed to be cool. The narrative of this crisis is written in these cascading, interconnected failures. It's a chain reaction. The African anticyclone pushes Saharan air north. The heat dome forms. Air temperatures rise, even higher. Asphalt melts. Rails warp. Forests, dried to tinder, catch fire. The fires detonate old bombs. The heat boils the rivers. The rivers can no longer cool the power plants. The power grids strain. Home air conditioners push demand higher. The price of electricity skyrockets. Inside homes not built for this heat, without AC, the human body cannot recover at night. Hospitals fill. The death toll rises. Each step in this chain is logical, predictable, and disastrous. And each step reveals a system operating at or beyond its design limits. The summer of 2026 is exposing the profound fragility of a civilization that believed it had conquered nature. It has not. It has merely built a complex and sophisticated life support system that is itself exquisitely sensitive to the environment it was meant to control. Now, as July begins, the dome of heat remains stubbornly in place over Central and Eastern Europe. forecast models offer little relief. The immediate meteorological cause is a stubborn, upper-level ridge of high pressure that refuses to budge. This blocking pattern prevents cooler maritime air from the Atlantic from sweeping across the continent and flushing the heat out. Until this atmospheric logjam breaks, the pressure will continue to build. Not just atmospheric pressure, but political, economic, and social pressure. The debate is no longer about whether the climate is changing, but about how to survive the climate that has already changed. It is about the brutal triage of what can be saved and what must be let go. Do you save the river or the grid? Do you run the trains or risk the rails? Do you send firefighters into a burning forest full of explosives? These are not the questions European leaders expected to be asking a decade ago. They are the questions they are being forced to answer today, in real time, with thousands of lives in the balance. 3 questions now hang over the continent, shimmering in the heat haze. How many more national temperature records can be broken before record-breaking becomes the norm? At what point does the cost of adapting our infrastructure to this new reality become truly insurmountable? And what happens to a society when the foundational promise of safety and stability is broken, not by war or recession, but by the air itself? The water in the Danube, discharged from the Paks power plant, is right now flowing south. A plume of unnaturally warm water moving through a river that is already too hot. It carries with it the heat of a nation's energy demand, a thermal scar marking the spot where policy met physics. And above it all, the heat dome sits, a silent, invisible weight of 191 million people baking under its glare, patiently waiting for the next system to fail.